There are stories buried in the blood-soaked soil of history that crawl under your skin and stay there. They are not tales of ghosts or ghouls, but of real human cruelty, of pain so extreme it defies imagination. These are the chronicles of men and women pushed to the absolute limit, who, in the face of unspeakable torment, showed a strength so profound it feels almost alien. They force us to stare into the abyss and ask what we would do in their place. What is the breaking point of the human will? And what power could possibly make a person immune to the fear of death itself? Welcome to History's Chronicles of Horror, where we unearth the true and terrifying legends of the past. Tonight, we descend into the paranoia and terror of ancient Rome to tell a story that stands alone in its bizarre, shocking, and stomach-turning nature. It is the story of a man whose execution became a display of defiance so audacious, it has echoed in whispers for nearly 2,000 years. A story of faith, fire, and a final, horrifying joke. Picture this. A bloodthirsty tyrant demands you surrender everything you hold sacred. You refuse. Your penalty is not a quick death, but the most agonizing end the state can devise: to be slowly, deliberately roasted alive over a bed of white-hot coals. Now, imagine that as the fire sears your skin and boils the flesh from your bones, you find the strength not merely to withstand the pain, but to mock it. The story of St. Lawrence is the story of a man who, while being burned for his faith, looked his executioners dead in the eye and defiantly told them to turn him over, because he was done on that side. This isn't just a tale of martyrdom. This is the story of how a Roman deacon's final, charitable act, combined with a shocking and fiery wit, transformed a gruesome execution into an eternal symbol of courage that would haunt the Roman Empire to its very core. To truly grasp the horror and astonishing climax of St. Lawrence's life, we have to travel back to the heart of a Roman Empire that was tearing itself apart. Forget the golden age of Augustus and the gleaming marble forums. We're plunging into the mid-3rd century, an era so violent and unstable it's known today as the crisis of the 3rd century. This was a 50-year-long nightmare of civil war, economic collapse, and relentless barbarian invasions. The empire was on its knees, stalked by plagues and paranoia. Emperors rose and fell with terrifying speed, often murdered by the very soldiers who were supposed to protect them. It was a desperate, bleeding world. It was into this chaos that Publius Licinius Valerianus, or Valerian, seized the imperial throne in 253 AD. Valerian was a veteran commander from a noble family, and he faced the impossible task of stitching a fractured empire back together. Like many iron-fisted rulers before him, he believed that unity could only be restored through a return to tradition. That meant one thing above all: universal, mandatory worship of the Roman gods. This wasn't just about piety, it was a political tool. Public sacrifices were seen as essential for securing divine favor and imposing order on a terrified populace. But there was a specter haunting the empire, a growing movement that stood in silent, stubborn opposition to this worldview: Christianity. To the Roman authorities, the Christians were a cancer. Their refusal to burn incense to the emperor or sacrifice to the gods wasn't seen as a private belief. It was treason. It was a rejection of what it meant to be Roman, an open invitation for the gods to unleash their wrath upon the entire empire. In the heart of this powder keg, in the city of Rome itself, a young man named Lawrence was quietly building a reputation within the city's Christian underground. Tradition tells us he was born around the year 225 in Huesca, a town in what is now Spain, though his precise origins are lost to the mists of time. What we do know is that he journeyed to Rome for his spiritual education. He was brilliant, driven, and possessed a compassion so fierce it caught the eye of the most powerful Christian in the city, the Bishop of Rome, Pope Sixtus II. Sixtus, himself a Greek scholar, saw a kindred spirit in Lawrence and entrusted him with immense responsibility. He ordained Lawrence and appointed him Archdeacon of Rome, the first among the city's 7 deacons. This was no mere ceremonial role. The deacons were the logistical and financial spine of the Roman Church. As Archdeacon, Lawrence was effectively the chief operating officer for the entire Christian community. He held the keys. His duties were twofold. First, he was the guardian of the church's physical wealth. In an age of persecution, This meant hiding and protecting the sacred liturgical vessels, chalices and patens, often crafted from gold and silver, and managing the secret donations from the faithful. He was the treasurer of a subversive organization. But his second, and far more dangerous, duty was to distribute those funds. Lawrence was the church's chief almoner, the master of an underground railroad of charity that was a hallmark of the early faith. It was his job to ensure that the city's outcasts, the poor, the widows, the orphans, the sick, were cared for. These were the people Roman society walked past without a second glance. Lawrence, however, knew their names. He knew the back alleys and squalid tenements where they hid. He walked where senators feared to tread. The material wealth of the church flowed through his hands, but he transformed it into bread for the starving and shelter for the homeless. He was the living embodiment of the Christian command to serve the least of these, which made him a beloved figure in Christian Rome, a man known not for power, but for service. This wasn't just a job for him, it was an obsession. Lawrence didn't see the church's gold as a treasure to be hoarded in a vault. He saw it as a weapon to be wielded in a war against suffering. He understood, perhaps more than anyone, where the true riches of the church were to be found. It was a conviction that would soon be tested in the most brutal way imaginable, as the storm of persecution that had been brewing for years was about to break, with Emperor Valerian aiming his fury directly at the leaders of the Christian faith. The year 257 AD began a new chapter of terror for the Christians of the Roman Empire. Emperor Valerian, desperate to crush any internal dissent while fighting wars on the frontier, unleashed a systematic, empire-wide persecution. His first edict was surgically precise, targeting the clergy. All bishops, priests, and deacons were ordered to perform a public sacrifice to the Roman gods. The penalty for refusal wasn't death, not yet. It was exile. Valerian's strategy was to cut the head off the snake, hoping the body would wither and die. For a year, a cold dread settled over the Christian community. Leaders were banished. The faithful met in secret, whispering prayers in the darkness of the catacombs. But exile wasn't enough for Valerian. The church, though wounded, refused to break. So, in the blistering summer of 258 AD, he issued a second edict, and this one was written in blood. The new decree was utterly merciless. It ordered the immediate arrest and summary execution of all Christian clergy. No more chances. No more exile. The order was animadvertanter, a cold Latin command for execution, usually by beheading. The edict went further, targeting wealthy lay Christians. Senators and knights who refused to renounce their faith would be stripped of their titles, their property seized by the state, and, if they persisted, they too would be killed. It was a full-scale war, designed to wipe out Christianity's leadership and plunder its assets for the imperial war chest. The fear in Rome became a tangible thing. On August 6, 258, the imperial guard struck. They found Pope Sixtus II presiding over a service in the catacomb of Praetextatus, one of the subterranean graveyards where Christians gathered. They dragged him out, along with 4 of his deacons. There was no trial. They were all beheaded that very same day. Lawrence wasn't with them. When news of the capture reached him, a desperate grief washed over him. He ran to find his beloved mentor, Sixtus, as he was being led away to his death. The accounts left to us by St. Ambrose paint a heartbreaking, frantic final exchange between the two men. Lawrence wept, not for his own life, but because he was being left behind. He cried out, "Father, where are you going without your son? Holy priest, where are you going without your deacon? You never offer the sacrifice without me at your side. What have I done to displease you? Have you found me unworthy? Test me now. See if you chose a worthy minister." Pope Sixtus, his own death just moments away, looked at his loyal deacon with a gaze of both sorrow and chilling prophecy. He didn't deny Lawrence his martyr's crown. He promised it. "I am not leaving you, my son," he said. "A more difficult trial is prepared for you. You will follow me in 3 days." Then he gave Lawrence one final, urgent command. Take every last piece of the church's wealth and give it all to the poor before the prefect of Rome could get his hands on it. Lawrence understood. The countdown had begun. The prefect, the city's chief magistrate and the emperor's enforcer, knew the church had assets. And he knew Lawrence was the man who held the keys. Just as Sixtus had prophesied, the authorities came for him. Soon after the Pope's execution, Lawrence was arrested and dragged before the prefect. The demand was blunt and greedy. "We know about your cult," the prefect sneered. "We know you use golden chalices and candlesticks. We know your bishops collect fortunes from rich widows. Bring out these hidden treasures. The emperor needs them to pay his soldiers. Surrender the riches of your church." Now, the prefect saw only gold and silver. He saw assets to be seized for the state. He looked at Lawrence and saw a simple treasurer, a man who could be threatened and broken. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Lawrence, standing before this embodiment of Roman power, didn't refuse. Instead, with a calm that must have infuriated the official, he seemed to play along. "The church is indeed rich," Lawrence replied, his words laced with a double meaning the prefect was blind to. "Far richer than your emperor." The prefect's eyes lit up with greed. Lawrence pressed his advantage. "Give me a little time. 3 days. Let me gather everything, make a full inventory, and I will present it all to you." The prefect, imagining carts overflowing with treasure, easily agreed. 3 days. It was a small price to pay for a massive windfall. For the prefect, it was an administrative delay. For Lawrence, it was a divine opportunity. He wasn't going to gather treasure. He was going to perform the most profound and defiant act of his life. He was going to gather the living treasures of God. With the prefect's 3-day deadline hanging over his head, Lawrence exploded into action. This was not the work of a man condemned, but of a man possessed by a holy mission. He moved through the streets of Rome with a terrifying purpose, the final command of his martyred pope burning in his heart. This wasn't a death march. It was the grand finale of his life's work. He began by liquidating every physical asset the church had left. He gathered the precious silver chalices and golden patens, the very objects the prefect was fantasizing about, and he sold them. He collected every last coin from the church's hidden treasury. He was systematically dismantling the material wealth of Roman Christianity, making certain that not one piece of gold would end up in Valerian's war chest. But this wasn't destruction, it was a sacred transformation. With the money, Lawrence began a 3-day odyssey into the dark, desperate heart of Roman poverty. He moved through the sprawling, chaotic city, from the grand forums down into the squalid, disease-ridden insulae, the towering, rickety apartment blocks where the city's poor were crammed like rats. He sought out the people he had served his entire life, the community he knew not as an abstract idea, but as individuals with names, faces, and haunted eyes. He found the widows, who had lost everything, and gave them the means to survive. He found the orphans, children abandoned to the streets, and made sure they had food. He sought out the crippled, the blind, and the sick, those who couldn't work and were shunned as cursed by their pagan neighbors. He found the outcasts and the broken, the people who were the bleeding, secret soul of the magnificent city. To each one, he gave money, but he gave them something more, an instruction. He told them to come with him on the 3rd day, to assemble before the prefect. We can only imagine the terror this must have sparked. Why would the chief magistrate of Rome want to see them? Were they all being arrested? But their faith in Lawrence, the deacon who had never failed them, was stronger than their fear. They agreed. For 3 days, the city witnessed a silent, miraculous reversal of wealth. Gold and silver were being melted down and turned into bread and dignity, flowing not up into the imperial palace, but down into the hands of the most destitute. Lawrence was conducting the church's final audit, and he was about to prove its infinite richness. Finally, the 3rd day dawned. The prefect sat in his tribunal, his greed palpable. He imagined chests of gold, sacks of silver, priceless artifacts being dragged before him. This was the day he would earn the emperor's praise and line the state's coffers. He heard a commotion at the doors. The moment was here. Lawrence appeared, just as he had promised. The prefect leaned forward, hungry, his eyes scanning the space behind the deacon for the gleam of treasure. Lawrence walked into the hall with a calm, almost theatrical dignity. He stopped before the prefect, who was now growing dangerously impatient. "Well," the prefect demanded, "where is the treasure of your church you promised me?" Lawrence smiled. He turned and gestured grandly towards the massive doors of the hall. And then, they came. Not carts of gold, but a flood of broken humanity. In shuffled the poor in their rags. In came the crippled, some on crude crutches, others carried by friends. In came the blind, their unseeing eyes turned toward the sound of the prefect's sputtering rage. In came the widows and the orphans, their faces a mixture of fear and trust. In came the sick, the lame, and the lepers, the entire congregation of the forgotten to whom Lawrence had dedicated his life. They filled the prefect's grand hall, a vast, silent, and overwhelmingly powerful crowd of the dispossessed. The air, which moments before had crackled with the expectation of wealth, was now thick with the undeniable presence of human need. The prefect stared, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, and finally, contorting into a mask of pure, incandescent fury. This was an insult, a public mockery of his power, of the emperor himself. He spun on Lawrence, his voice shaking with rage. "What is the meaning of this charade? I demanded the treasures of your church, and you bring me this filth." This was the moment. This was the sermon for which Lawrence was willing to die. He stood tall, his voice ringing out, clear and unwavering, for all to hear. He pointed to the sea of faces, the living assembly of the weak and the poor. "You asked for the treasures of the church," he declared. "Behold, these are the true treasures of the church." Some accounts claim he even added, with a defiant twist of the knife, "The church is truly rich, far richer than your emperor." The statement was an explosion. It was an act of theological warfare. Rome valued power, gold, and legions. Lawrence declared that the kingdom of God valued the weak, the poor, and the broken. He had taken the prefect's greed and turned it into a living, breathing parable. Pious legend claims that several senators present were so stunned by his courage that they converted on the spot, though this is likely a later embellishment to the tale. But the prefect didn't hear a sermon. He heard the insolence of a traitor who had not only defied a direct imperial order, but had humiliated him in the most public way possible. His rage boiled over into a lust for a punishment so exquisitely cruel, so agonizing, that it would serve as a warning for all time. The die was cast. Lawrence's ultimate act of charity had sealed his fate. He would not be granted the swift death of a beheading. For this level of defiance, the prefect devised a death of slow, relentless, and unimaginable torment. A death by fire. The prefect's fury was a thing of pure, black poison. The public humiliation demanded a spectacle of unparalleled cruelty. Lawrence would not get the mercy of a quick sword stroke, the death granted to Pope Sixtus. No, for his theatrical insolence, he would be made into a public horror show, his death a slow, agonizing lesson in what happens when you mock the power of Rome. Now, we must be clear. The cold, official record of history, the kind written by governors and scribes, would suggest that Lawrence was most likely beheaded, just like his pope. It was the standard, lawful method. But that is not the story that was told. That is not the legend that gripped the soul of the city and set the Christian world ablaze. The story that has been passed down in whispers of horror and awe for nearly 2 millennia is one of fire, iron, and a courage so insane it borders on divine. According to the powerful tradition recorded by giants of the early church like St. Ambrose and the poet Prudentius, the prefect ordered his men to construct a unique instrument of torture, a massive iron grill, a gridiron, built for one purpose. It was placed over a bed of slow-burning coals, designed to cook a man to death. Lawrence was dragged to the site of his execution. He was stripped naked and bound, hand and foot. The soldiers, following their horrific orders, hoisted him up and laid him down on the cold, hard bars of the gridiron. Then, the glowing embers were shoveled underneath. The process was a symphony of agony. The iron would have heated slowly, turning from cold to warm, then to a searing, unbearable heat. The smell of his own burning flesh would have filled his nostrils. The pain is simply beyond our comprehension, a living nightmare of escalating torment designed to produce one thing: a broken man, screaming and begging for the mercy of a quick death. This is what the prefect wanted. This is what the crowd expected. But Lawrence did not break. He did not scream. He did not beg. Instead, as the fire licked at his body, a serene, almost unnerving peace settled on his face. The ancient accounts say he burned with such a love for God that the physical torment seemed secondary. His faith was not just a shield for his soul, it was an anesthetic for his nerves. He lay there, his flesh charring and sticking to the iron bars, enduring a pain that should have shattered his sanity. Yet his mind remained clear. His will remained unbroken, and his sense of humor remained lethally sharp. After a long time had passed, long enough for one side of his body to be grotesquely burned, he performed the act that would make him immortal. He turned his head, looked calmly at his tormentors, perhaps even locking eyes with the disbelieving prefect, and spoke. His voice wasn't a pained whisper. It was a clear, steady, and shockingly witty command. "Turn me over," he said. "I'm done on this side." The statement is so audacious, so completely insane in the face of such suffering, that it stops the heart. It is a line dripping with contempt, with a humor so dark it's almost holy. He was treating his own horrific execution like a steak on a barbecue. He was robbing his tormentors of their power, refusing to give them the satisfaction of his pain. He was mocking their cruelty, asserting his spiritual freedom even as they destroyed his body. He proved that while they could kill him, they couldn't break him. They couldn't even ruin his mood. The soldiers, stunned into obedience, must have flipped his body over onto the searing grill. A fresh wave of unimaginable agony would have coursed through him. Yet, Lawrence endured. As he felt his life finally slipping away, he spoke one last time. Looking at his executioners, he announced, "It is cooked enough now. You can eat." And with those final words, his ordeal was over. But before he died, he offered one last prayer. It wasn't for himself. It was a prayer for the city that was murdering him. He prayed for the conversion of Rome. Then, Lawrence, the Deacon of Rome, died. It was August 10th, 258 AD. The effect of this display was catastrophic for the authorities. They had wanted to create a deterrent. Instead, they had created a superhero. The story of the deacon who joked while being roasted alive spread through Rome like wildfire. Lawrence had faced the fire, and instead of being consumed, he had used its flames to illuminate the power of his faith for the entire world to see. The death of St. Lawrence was not an ending. It was an explosion. Valerian and his prefect had tried to use fire to cauterize the Christian movement, to burn it out with fear. Instead, the horrifying spectacle of his martyrdom became a powerful fuel for the very faith they wanted to destroy. His story was living proof of a power that Roman steel could not kill and Roman fire could not burn. The impact on the Roman people was profound. The courage and macabre humor Lawrence showed on the gridiron didn't inspire terror. It inspired a terrified awe. Roman culture prized virtus, fortitude, and manliness, and here was a man who embodied it to a supernatural degree. For pagans who saw it or heard the story, the question was inescapable. What god inspires a man to crack jokes while being cooked alive? His death likely did more to win converts than 100 sermons. He showed that faith wasn't a crutch for the weak, but the source of an impossible strength. As he died, Lawrence prayed for Rome's conversion, and the very manner of his death planted the seeds of that prayer's fulfillment. Within decades, the cult of St. Lawrence became one of the most revered in the Christian world, especially in Rome. When Emperor Constantine the Great ended the persecutions in the 4th century, the veneration of Lawrence was already a massive force. Constantine himself built a small chapel over Lawrence's tomb, a site that would eventually become one of Rome's 7 great pilgrimage churches, the Basilica di San Lorenzo fuori le mura, St. Lawrence outside the walls. His name was carved into the very heart of the church's liturgy, mentioned by name in the Roman canon, the central prayer of the Mass, placing him in the elite company of the apostles. His feast day, August 10th, became a major celebration. Lawrence's legacy also twisted in fascinating, symbolic ways, each an echo of his life and horrifying death. Because of the gridiron, he is, famously, the patron saint of cooks, chefs, and anyone who works with fire. It's a testament to the Christian ability to redeem even the most horrific objects, turning an instrument of torture into the symbol of a trade. Because of his astonishing wit in the face of death, he is also the patron saint of comedians and archivists. This patronage recognizes humor as a weapon of resilience, a way to defy despair. His jokes weren't frivolous. They were a form of spiritual warfare. And as the keeper of the church's records, which he protected from the state, he became the patron of librarians and archivists, guardians of knowledge. But most importantly, because of his final act of defiance, he is the patron saint of the poor and marginalized. His declaration that the poor were the true treasures of the church became a cornerstone of Christian charity. Even the night sky bears his memory. The Perseid meteor shower, which peaks every year around his feast day of August 10th, became known in Catholic folklore as the tears of St. Lawrence, the fiery embers of his martyrdom ascending into the heavens. While the literal accuracy of the gridiron story is debated by historians, many believe it arose from a simple scribe's error, confusing the Latin passus est, he suffered, with assus est, he was roasted. The power of the legend is absolute. Whether historical fact or sacred folklore, the story of the gridiron captured Lawrence's spirit so perfectly that it became his truth. It embodies his fiery faith, his sharp mind, and his total commitment to the true, living treasures of the Church. The story of St. Lawrence is more than a gruesome tale from the ancient world. It is a profound meditation on what we value, what we fear, and the terrifying power of conviction. It forces us to ask, what do we truly treasure? In a world that still prizes wealth and power, Lawrence's life is a blistering indictment of those priorities. He reminds us, in the most dramatic way possible, that true wealth isn't what we keep, but what we give away. His story also speaks to the resilience of the human spirit when it is set on fire by faith. To face an agonizing death is one thing. To face it with a punchline is something else entirely. Lawrence's final, defiant jokes were a radical declaration of freedom. He was showing his torturers that while they had power over his body, they had zero power over his soul. Faith wasn't just his comfort. It was his weapon, a joy that could not be extinguished by any pain. If this glimpse into one of history's most terrifying and inspiring martyrdoms has chilled you to the bone, please subscribe to History's Chronicles of Horror for more stories that have been buried by time. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an expedition into the dark corners of the past. And share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of St. Lawrence's story will haunt you the most? In the end, the fire meant to destroy St. Lawrence only served to forge his legacy, burning away everything but the pure, unbreakable core of his faith and charity. He stands forever as a giant of history, a deacon who knew that God was most present in the lives of the poor. He is the saint who laughed in the face of tyranny, the martyr who turned his own execution into a sermon, and the eternal patron of the forgotten. His story is a fiery, unforgettable horror story, a reminder that the greatest treasures are not of this world, and that sometimes the brightest light shines from the heart of the deepest darkness. St. Lawrence, pray for us.